The radio call came in just after sunrise, the kind that changed the tone inside a squad car. A woman had been found down near the curb in Oak Cliff, close enough to an elementary school that the chain-link fence and playground equipment sat in view. The first officer stepped into damp grass and saw her shoes, still on, toes pointed toward the road as if someone had placed her there. He swept his flashlight over her face and felt his stomach drop. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Someone had taken time here, and the scene carried a deliberate, practiced cruelty. By the time homicide detectives reached the location on March 13, 1991, neighbors were already gathering at a distance, silent and rigid, behind the first strip of yellow tape. Detectives moved with the calm they relied on in front of crowds, but the details forced them to slow down. There were gunshot wounds. The body's position suggested it hadn't simply collapsed where the victim fell. And when the medical examiner's staff confirmed what seasoned investigators feared, the case snapped into a pattern that had been haunting Dallas for months. Shirley Williams had been killed, and her eyes were missing. Oak Cliff had been on edge since late 1990, when Mary Lou Pratt, a sex worker known in the area, was found dead. She had been shot, and the examination revealed the same rare mutilation. Detectives tried to control the information because they knew the effect it would have if the city latched on to that detail, but the streets already had their own communications, and fear moved faster than press releases. Women who worked along the stroll began trading warnings, watching headlights, and refusing rides from men who felt wrong in a way they couldn't always explain. In February 1991, Susan Peterson was found dead not far from where Pratt had been discovered. She had been shot, and again, her eyes were missing. The repetition changed everything. This wasn't a single bizarre homicide. It was a repeat offender returning to the same neighborhood, selecting the same type of victim, and taking the same thing. Detectives began lining up photographs, reports, and timelines, looking for what stayed consistent and what shifted. The city wanted a simple explanation. Investigators needed specifics: where the victims were last seen, how they were approached, and how the killer moved through the neighborhood without being caught. There was also an older case detectives couldn't ignore. In 1988, Rhonda Bowie, another woman connected to the same streets, had been found stabbed to death in Oak Cliff. Her case did not include the missing eyes, but it sat in the same geography and the same world of late-night danger that Dallas had learned to look past. Investigators kept it in their files, asking whether it belonged to the same man or whether Oak Cliff had simply endured more than one predator. After Shirley Williams was found near a school, the pressure intensified. The location jolted the city. It wasn't an alley where violence was expected. It was near a place parents walked children. To detectives, it suggested a killer who felt safe, who believed the neighborhood belonged to him after dark, and who didn't fear the body being discovered quickly. That kind of confidence could come from familiarity with the area, or from a life built on slipping in and out without consequences. Homicide squads flooded Oak Cliff. Officers worked the streets, talking to women who rarely trusted police, listening for patterns in stories that sounded like rumor until you heard the same description twice. A crucial lead came when a woman told investigators she had witnessed an attack and could describe the man involved. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, ran down vehicles seen circling late at night, and tried to identify anyone who fit the descriptions and had reason to be in the area when the victims disappeared. The missing eyes forced another question detectives couldn't avoid. Who could do this quickly outside a controlled setting? They considered medical training, but the act didn't read like a sterile procedure. It looked like an obsession carried out with purpose. That widened the net to people with anatomical skill outside medicine, including hunters and taxidermists, people who worked with blades and knew the exact pressure needed to cut precisely. Charles Albright began to stand out in that search. He lived in North Oak Cliff. He worked as a carpenter and handyman, a man who could blend into ordinary life and still be out at odd hours without drawing attention. Neighbors described him as intelligent and personable when he chose to be. Investigators also saw his history: theft, forgery, time in prison, a long relationship with deception, and they learned about his background in taxidermy, a skill he had picked up as a child, including delicate work around animal eyes. For detectives trying to understand the signature, it was a detail that refused to sit quietly. They built the case the way many cases were built then, through interviews, surveillance, and the slow accumulation of connections that were strong in context, even when each piece looked small alone. They compared witness descriptions to what they could confirm. They mapped where the victims were last seen and who moved through those blocks at night. They looked for links to the women, to the streets, to the time windows, and they pressed every lead until it either held or broke. On March 22, 1991, police arrested Albright. In Oak Cliff, the news didn't erase fear in a single day. People wanted to know whether the killings would stop and whether the right man was in custody. Detectives kept working the earlier cases, trying to strengthen what could still be proven and connect evidence that had already been battered by time, weather, and the unforgiving nature of outdoor crime scenes. When the case went to trial later that year, the courtroom battle showed how hard it was to turn a terrifying pattern into a conviction that could survive scrutiny. Prosecutors focused on Shirley Williams, the case they believed had the strongest chain of evidence. They laid out witness testimony, forensic findings, and the broader pattern that had gripped Dallas. The defense attacked gaps, argued coincidence, and pushed the idea that disgust and fear were being used to fill holes in proof. In December 1991, the jury convicted Albright of the murder of Shirley Williams and sentenced him to life in prison. The other murder charges connected to Mary Lou Pratt and Susan Peterson were later dropped because prosecutors said they could not meet the burden of proof in those cases. To the public, it sounded like an answer with an asterisk. To detectives, it was a conviction that stopped a man they believed was responsible, even if it didn't resolve every open file. The nickname Eyeball Killer followed Albright in headlines, a label that captured the horror while reducing the victims to a single detail. Investigators who worked the case spoke later about what the headlines obscured. These were women whose lives had been treated as disposable long before they were killed, and whose deaths forced the city to confront violence it had learned to ignore when it happened to people on the margins. Albright remained in Texas custody for the rest of his life and died in prison in 2020. The case he left behind stayed lodged in Dallas history, defined by a rare signature and by the reality that one conviction did not erase every question. For the people who lived and worked in Oak Cliff, the months between December 1990 and March 1991 were remembered in the simplest way, as the time when someone hunted the streets and the city finally had to pay attention. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.